Everybody always has the facts. Everyone always has a truth, the claim on reality. Rather than focusing on the argument, we shift. We pivot our attention to the emotional undercurrents and interactional patterns unfolding in real time. It's about noticing how the conversation is happening, not about what's being said. I know this sounds a little complicated, but this is a really valuable intervention. Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. This is another episode in our series on healing narcissistic personality dynamics. If you're new to this series, I want to share how we're approaching things. In the last episode, I mentioned that instead of analyzing narcissistic traits and their everyday manifestations, we're taking a different path. We're looking at narcissism from the inside out by getting underneath the surface and exploring the emotional patterns and real-life moments that I experience every day in my work with these individuals. One of the questions I'm asked most often is, can a narcissist really change? In these episodes, my goal is to show how real change might look, not in abstract terms, but through emotional patterns that unfold in therapy, in relationships, and within the internal world of the narcissistic individual. In today's episode, we'll be focusing specifically on how to work with or relate to someone who fluctuates between grandiosity and vulnerability. These two emotional poles often show up together in moments of stress or conflict, and understanding how they interact is crucial to facilitating change. We'll begin with a clinical example that illustrates this dynamic in real time. I want to illustrate what happens when the grandiose self rises up to protect against feelings that feel too painful to face, like fear, shame, or the terror of rejection. Have you ever wondered, how do you help someone soften their defenses? Someone who's very defensive. How do you soften that without shaming them? Or even worse, triggering a collapse or triggering a fight. This kind of work is very delicate. It's about timing, emotional safety, and recognizing the defenses at play without directly confronting them in a way that leads to rupture. I'll walk you through the process, what I look for, how I intervene, and how I assess whether a person is ready to metabolize the deeper emotional content that lies beneath their grandiose sense of self presentation. Beneath the anger, that's part of the grandiose sense of self. Beneath the superiority, beneath withdrawing. So, whether you're doing your own inner work or trying to stay connected to someone with narcissistic defenses, I hope this episode offers a compassionate and clear framework for understanding how emotional healing really begins. So here's one of the big questions that comes up in a lot of the work that I do. How do you actually help someone move through the tug of war, or, let me say it differently, navigate the tension between these two extremes? That's the grandiosity and the vulnerability, especially when both are flaring up in real time and things are getting hot. To tackle this question, let me briefly describe, by way of an example, how grandiosity and vulnerability coexist and how they show up in everyday life. Take a moment to notice, in this example, what stands out to you. Let's say I was working with a couple when it became increasingly clear, and I reflected this to the husband, that he becomes very verbally abusive towards his wife. He initially denied it, but as I stayed with the moment and I supported her in finding her voice, she eventually said to her husband, "I'm scared of you." We began to explore what might have led to this angry dynamic. In this particular instance, she had entered the room angry and upset because she felt abandoned by him when he himself retreated to the room for longer than she had anticipated. Her tone and posture conveyed those feelings. I was able to help both of them see that underneath the escalating conflict, he too was scared when she approached in this angry way. In other words, they were both scared, only he didn't show it. Instead, he responded by puffing up, raising his voice, and talking to her in a devaluing way. In those moments, he was activating, guess what? His grandiose self, using it to push away, again, guess what? The more vulnerable side of himself, and the fear that she came in angry and would reject him. And that fear was one that he couldn't tolerate. So in activating his grandiosity through the aggression, right, through the anger, through devaluing, he didn't need to process those feelings. Now, here is the most important thing about the intervention. It's about the attempt to, and I quote, integrate. And that's a really important word, because the grandiose and the vulnerable sense of self typically are what? Split off. They're not integrated. This is part of the fragmented sense of self that underlies all personality disorders. So it's about the attempt to integrate the vulnerable side of himself. Stated differently, it's about gently naming the possibility that underneath his anger and puffed up response was something much more vulnerable. Whether or not an intervention like this is helpful really depends on where the person is in their emotional growth and how much discomfort or emotional intensity they're able to stay with in the moment. For some, being confronted with the idea that their aggression is rooted in fear or shame might feel too humiliating or provoke further defensiveness. For this insight to truly land, it also depends on the person's capacity to make a link to something that's not consciously accessible at the moment. And as you can imagine, that's a higher level of development. And that's why I didn't talk about this intervention in part 1. We need to lay the groundwork to help somebody get to this place where they could begin to make this what is considered a bit of a leap. It can seem almost paradoxical, even crazy to the individual, that their grandiosity and aggressive behavior is driven by vulnerability, because these vulnerable feelings are often deeply concealed, far from conscious awareness. But when there's enough trust in the relationship or enough internal readiness, there's the readiness again, and that's why this is a process to be able to talk to somebody in this way. These insights can open the door to a deeper kind of reflection. It becomes an opportunity to metabolize emotional pain that's often been, and you know what? Disavowed, disowned, projected, or split off. In other words, they're not aware of the vulnerability. And that's the whole point of the grandiose sense of self, an angry, devaluing attitude. Now, make no mistake, this is delicate work, and timing is everything. This is where most couples actually get into trouble, reacting to each other's defensive anger, never getting underneath to the vulnerable emotions that drive the cycle of conflict and fighting. This is where the therapeutic work actually begins, helping the individual recognize when those defenses are at play and slowly helping them to tolerate, and again, that word, integrate the vulnerable feelings that they've long avoided. In the early phases of treatment, or if we don't get the sense that they can make the kind of link that I'm discussing here between the grandiosity and vulnerability, we don't begin by directly confronting the grandiosity. Again, this is where most couples get into trouble, because there's an inappropriate focus on the grandiosity, on the anger, sometimes even calling their loved one, and I quote, a narcissist or a control freak or pathetic. I say pathetic for the more vulnerable narcissistic presentation. Remember, those are the more clingy, needy type of narcissist who don't present necessarily with overt grandiosity. But in any matter, they use these labels. And this kind of labeling usually is not coming out of nowhere. What I mean by that is these labels often get used when someone, like the partner, feels powerless themselves or hurt or overwhelmed by their partner's behavior. So they reach for a way to name what's happening. But the problem is these labels target the defenses rather than the pain underneath it. This kind of confrontation, as you can imagine, or you yourself may have experienced, usually triggers what? More defensiveness, not insight, not slowing down, not reflection, which is where we want to be. If your comments, or in my case, my interpretations, are rushed or come out of frustration or anger, such as, and I quote here, do you think you need to feel superior in order to avoid feeling worthless? Or something about how they are trying to control you because they can't tolerate feeling vulnerable and weak. They can easily lead to rupture rather than reflection. Comments like these are often met with a knee-jerk rejection, arrogant dismissal, or retreats into a state of confusion, like getting really confused and not understanding. Even though you thought you were talking to somebody, suddenly they don't understand what you're referring to. This is what renowned psychoanalyst Otto Kernberg calls, and I quote, pseudo-stupidity, not meaning that these people are stupid by no means. Usually they're quite intelligent, but that's why it's a pseudo-stupidity, because suddenly if you puncture the defensive barrier, they get very confused. So, if we go back to the question, how do you help someone navigate the tug of war between grandiosity and vulnerability? This example shows that the first step is recognizing when grandiosity is actually covering something softer underneath, like fear or shame because one has felt abandoned or rejected. That awareness opens the door for deeper work, but only if the person is ready. I'm emphasizing that part because if they're not, we go back to step one. Again, if you go back to the prior episode, I detailed it there. That's the act of containment. Okay, now maybe as you're listening, you notice something in yourself here. Maybe you recognize moments where you felt puffed up, or you lashed out, or you shut down, even though underneath there was fear or hurt that you couldn't quite put into words. That's important. It doesn't mean something's wrong with you, just like it doesn't mean something's wrong with your partner. It means you've built a structure to survive something, as did they, that once felt too overwhelming. The real challenge in therapy and in relationships is finding a way to get close to that truth without triggering more defensiveness or shame. Because the defenses aren't random, they're there for a reason. So that's why we have to be very careful and respect that they're there for good reason. And if we could slow things down enough and create enough safety, that's where change can begin. So, something that I may say to the husband in this example that I'm giving, it goes something like this. That's his angry response. It seems like that response feels important to you in the moment. See, that's a safe place to start. Or, again, depending on where this person is, like how much prior work has been done, how strong is the alliance, what's their capacity for reflecting, you might be able to use a higher level intervention. This is a more complicated intervention, which may look like this. I can see that it's important for you to respond that way. Again, the anger. I'm talking about the anger or the devaluing. I can see how important it is for you to respond that way. We just don't know what purpose that anger serves. Do you have any thoughts on that? See, for some patients, this intervention could feel like a little too fixed, almost like assigning intention or motivation, right? So that's why I said that's a higher level intervention, because now we're beginning to help them reflect on, was there some motivation behind my need to devalue you? What is the point of this line of intervention? If we just step back and we think, all of what I'm suggesting, I'm demonstrating different ways that I talk to patients. But the main point you may now be asking is what? The goal is to be both containing and inviting. And that's the difference, again, from the first episode. Now we're inviting curiosity. We're not just containing and validating. You're not labeling the anger as wrong. You're wondering with the person, or and me, in my example, with a patient, you're beginning to wonder about the anger. The focus, you may have noticed, is not on why did you do that, but instead it's what might this be serving? And in my experience, this usually opens the door and invites self-reflection. You're inviting insight without provoking further defensiveness because you're not blaming them. And that's the sweet spot in this kind of work. Hard to reach, but nevertheless, that's exactly where you want to be. But this raises an important question. Why is it that even when an insight feels spot on, sometimes it still doesn't land? Why do interpretations that seem accurate sometimes backfire or even make things worse? To understand that, we have to look more closely at what these comments are actually touching and why timing, trust, and the tone matter so much more when we get close to someone's vulnerable core.
You know, they say teaching is the mother of all professions, but right now it feels like it's happening inside a pressure cooker. That's why we created Higher Listenings, bringing a dose of joy to the future of learning. We're exploring things like why reading may not be obsolete after all, the remarkable connection between emotion and learning, and the real reason students cheat.
It's not a moral failing. It's the circumstances that they find themselves in.
Join us on Higher Listenings, because those who can make a difference teach.
So, why do these comments sometimes fail? Because one reason is they cut too close to the core of vulnerability without enough containment, alliance, or trust. Even if the comment, or in my case, interpretation about abandonment or vulnerability or rejection, for instance, is technically correct, it bypasses the narcissistic patient's defensive structure, the very thing that's protecting them from feeling these things that I'm describing. Sometimes they also fail because at times they're said with aggression. I mentioned this earlier, and typically are meant to attack, not genuinely try to understand and connect. So, with the couple that I'm talking about, you may see a shift that looks like progress one moment, like he's able to acknowledge his behavior. And sometimes you may have experienced this too, like you're really reaching somebody, that they show some curiosity about their aggressive reaction or the way they devalue you. But then in the next moment, there's a snapback. He might suddenly mock the therapy or start mocking me, making fun of me, or minimize his wife's feelings, or accuse her of over-exaggerating in terms of the way he behaved. And I'm sure you've heard this before. The vulnerable part that briefly peeked through gets quickly buried under contempt or denial, instead of allowing the link between fear, vulnerability, and aggression to deepen. The narcissistic structure scrambles to reassert control and superiority, and there's the grandiose sense of self again. It reappears. And by the way, this is very typical, and this is why it's a working through process. It appears, and then we work on it, it disappears, and there's a moment of vulnerability, and then it reappears. But this is not like resistance. This is not resistance. It's a desperate attempt to preserve psychic equilibrium. It's not uncommon at this point when things feel too exposed. Some people might suddenly pull away, cut off the conversation, insist that you or no one understands them. Maybe they walk away or even storm out entirely, threaten to break off the relationship or end therapy. In that moment, it's not really about who they're talking to or how they're behaving, what they're saying. It's all about needing to protect a shaky sense of self that feels like it's starting to crack. So, in these moments, it's really important to slow things down and try to create a sense of emotional safety. Sometimes that means stepping back from the argument itself and paying attention to how things are happening between you. This is really important. So this is another level of intervention, another type of intervention. This means you say to them something like, "What just happened right now? Did we hit a nerve?" That pause can keep the conversation from spiraling, and it helps both people to stay connected rather than overwhelmed by emotions they might not yet be able to tolerate. Like I mentioned, this is a technique or a tool one can use. I have to come back to this and develop it more deeply, but in short, this is what we call moving from the content to the process. Content to process. Please keep that in mind because, like I said, it's another technique and we can use that. If we develop it more deeply, I want to just say something very briefly about process versus content. Rather than focusing on what's being said, the story, the facts. Everybody always has the facts. Everyone always has a truth, the claim on reality. Rather than focusing on the argument, we shift. We pivot our attention to the emotional undercurrents and interactional patterns unfolding in real time. It's about noticing how the conversation is happening, not about what's being said. I know this sounds a little complicated, but this is a really valuable intervention. That's often where the deeper work and the connection can begin. So let me give an example. If there's a couple who's arguing and she says something to him like, after he devalued her, and they make up, and then she keeps mentioning, "Now I have to detach from you." He gets annoyed and he's like, "Why do you have to keep saying that? Why do you have to detach from me?" Now, with that kind of couple, I would slow that down and say, this is a very important question. Do you think you can actually ask that as a question rather than a provocation, right? You see, because he's not asking it in a way that's very curious, but it's a legitimate question. Why do you say you're going to have to detach from me? And then he thinks, and you know how it works in somebody's mind, when they think something, it must be true. He thinks that she's saying it just to hurt him or just to be manipulative. So then you check in. Instead of accusing, you say, "Are you just saying that to hurt me?" See, this is very different from using it again as a proclamation or an attack on them, which is only going to escalate things. So it would look more like, "I wonder why you mentioned that just now. I heard you earlier when you said you have to detach from me, but what is it you're trying to tell me? What is it going to look like? And I also wonder, and I'm beginning to feel that maybe you're just trying to hurt me, but I want to check in with you. Am I reading that correctly?" Again, I know I'm not doing justice to it right now, but I think you get the overall sense. I'm trying to capture how to stay in the moment in terms of what's happening. Instead of reacting to it, you're becoming curious. Okay, anyway, let's go back to the risk involved. Remember, that was the original question. I digressed a little bit with this other level or this other type of intervention. But back to the risk involved. There's another, more subtle risk when you confront the narcissism or vulnerability. That's what we were talking about prematurely. The other person seems to agree with you. They might nod. They may even echo back your insights with apparent self-awareness. On the surface, this can look like progress. like insight is being gained. But what's often happening beneath the surface is sometimes, or something that's more defensive. They're forming what we call an intellectual understanding. And that's what I meant by they're agreeing with you. So it's an intellectual understanding of these dynamics without any real affective integration. They adopt your language, your framing of the problem, and sometimes even your insights, but nothing really seems to change. If you have ever encountered something like that, you could begin to wonder, is this just an intellectual understanding? Anyway, let me go back to the couple. After I name the link between the fear and his aggressive outburst, the husband might nod and say that he sees that. I guess I get scared and then I lash out. Now that sounds insightful, but in the following session, there wasn't any openness or curiosity. It was a pivot back to rationalizing his behavior, minimizing its impact, and subtle and actually blaming, again, putting the onus on his wife. This kind of insight, pseudo-insight, is particularly tricky to navigate because it masquerades as progress while simultaneously keeping the core affect of vulnerability or fear safely at bay. And maybe you've experienced something like this yourself, where you understood the pattern intellectually, could even name it out loud, but still found yourself stuck in the same loop. That's not failure. It just means the work hasn't made contact with the part of you that still feels afraid or unworthy or unseen. In other words, we still don't have that integration at that moment. That's the place we have to gently learn to stay with, that more vulnerable side, because that's where the real change, as you're hearing in this episode, that's where the real change lies. So, what are some ways we could begin to address this kind of defensive pattern? This pseudo-intellectualization, right? The pseudo-insight, I should say. How do we address it in real time when it comes up? Well, that will be a topic of our next episode on healing narcissism, because unfortunately we have to start to wrap things up here for today. Again, I think we covered a lot of ground. In this second episode on this topic of healing narcissism, what did we cover? What did we talk about? We spoke about naming the grandiose defense without confronting it, such as, it seems like that response feels important to you in the moment. Remember that one? And then slowing down and tracking the process, not the content. Those were two of the, I think, most important things that emerged in this episode. Process, not content. And I went over a few examples of that a bit earlier. With that, the core technique, I said, is to shift from debating the content of what's being said, who's right and who's wrong, to noticing what's happening between people, two people in the moment. So, to come back to our original question, can a narcissist really change? I hope you're beginning to see the answer isn't simple, but it's hopeful. Change at this point in the process doesn't happen by confronting the grandiosity head on or by forcing connections, insights too quickly. So let me hold off there. We're going to get into all of this in the next episode on healing narcissism. But as always, if you have any questions or if there's any way you want to see this series shape up, feel free to reach out. I love to hear from you. Shoot me an email. But until next time, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.